Around a third of children in the United Kingdom will experience their parents separating by the time they're 16. In excess of 200,000 children a year. How family change of this order of magnitude is managed is clearly very important. Mervyn Murch, who is Emeritus Professor of Law at Cardiff University, has spent a professional lifetime studying family law, much of it relating to parental separation. Along with his longtime friend and clinical social psychologist colleague, Professor Douglas Hooper, he coined the term family justice system to describe the network of practitioners that family members are likely to meet. Indeed, the system they become a part of as parents separate. He has researched, written and taught about the interface between family law and mental health over many years, and his work received civic recognition in 2007 when he was awarded a CBE. Now, he has assembled the fruits of his labours in a book on participative family justice. The book is called Supporting Children When Parents Separate, embedding a crisis intervention approach within family justice, education and mental health policy. This book represents the culmination of a lifetime's work. Mervyn and I go back a long way. Indeed, back to my postgraduate university days when he was a father of young children and I was a young graduate learning law as part of my social work training. I'm now a consultant psychotherapist and senior fellow at the Tavistock Institute of Medical Psychology. We have much in common. We both started our professional lives as probation officers. We've both worked from our different disciplines to understand the mix of psychological, social and legal processes affecting how parental separation is managed. We're both fellows of the Centre for Social Policy at Dartington, and we both continue to share a commitment to improving the well-being of individuals and communities. Having read and been intrigued by his most recent book, I decided to visit him at his home in Bristol, the birthplace of family mediation. Mervyn, it's really nice actually having this opportunity to come and have a conversation with you about your lifetimes and your work. And one of the sort of opening questions I've got to you is how, as a man who went to Oxford to read law, how did you get caught up in thinking about social systems, social networks, mental health, the things that you've been very interested in combining in your professional life?
Well, I think it started almost by accident that I got involved with this Crime Challenge student society in Oxford, and eventually became chairman of the thing for a term. And then I found myself being recruited to be either a prison governor or a probation officer. I tried out and through one of the prison commissioners who had come to Oxford, which I'd invited to come and talk to students and people. And he said, oh, I can arrange for you to go into prison as a prisoner on the receiving end.
So you saw things from the inside out. You actually went to prison.
I did.
Right, yeah.
So I ended up in East Church prison for a month, and with all kinds of funny things. And I saw all kinds of, tobacco baroning and all things like that. I thought I had to have a story, a cover story. So I said that I had stolen some pokers from Woolworths to sell to American tourists who used to come to my room, which we called was Pope's the Poet. So it was known as Pope's Pokers. What an extraordinary daft story it was. Anyway, what of course I realized is that I knew all along that I was a student, because the red band in the governor's office went through all the papers and saw all the correspondence. The governor said, if they find out and they don't take to you, we'll let one of the prison officers, or the screws as they call them, know, and we'll get you out quick, or else you might, get beaten up. So
you've got these formal systems and then the informal networks that really know what's going on.
Exactly. Yeah. But they said, well, as I was blagging for 3 days with this improbable story, it showed that I had some good old dishonesty in me, and that was it. So that's how I sort of saw that. And then I arranged with the chief probation officer, a man called Ken Thompson in Oxford, to do a similar sort of placement with a probation officer. So I thought it was much easier. Probation was more my sort of style. But then I was called up into the army, so I had to go off into the army for 2 years to do my national service as an army school teacher, and then came back. By that time at the Home Office, I'd been selected as the Home Office to do probation training, postgraduate in Bristol, because Bristol at that time, again going back to Oxford, there was a man called John Spencer who organised something called the Bristol Social Project, which was a big post-war study of the ins and outs of social relationships in housing estates and all kinds of things, including the mobile gypsy population around Bristol, to do this social study. So I thought it sounded a really good place to go. By the time after I did my military service, it had all packed up and was hardly ever published. But that was it. Anyway, so I came here and did my probation training.
But then you made the leap from probation into the world of universities and academia.
Oh, much later. I mean, I went to be a probation officer in Devon after 2 years, and then I was invited to come back because they knew I was teaching law. You were one of my
I was one of your students. I remember this at Exeter University, yes. Yeah.
Many distinguished students who probably
Not so
knew more about
distinguished in
things
law.
than I did. But anyway, I did my day down there, and so I came back to teach law, but then found that Bristol had a new university mental health department. And because my social work training and experience was relatively limited, it was arranged for me to do a day a week in the mental health department as a social worker. The professor of community mental health, a man called Derek Russell Davis, he wanted to call us all psychotherapists, but I usually did basically case histories, but I had a few cases. And I used to go to all the lectures and things that were in the department, and there was quite a link between the social work department and the mental health department, although we were in economics and then in education, because he didn't have a professorial head of department. So, and in the end, there was a battle over the future of social work in Bristol University teaching between the medical school and mental health on the one side, and education and economics on the other.
And you had input from all these sources. So
now, all this is important for
yes.
much later, because I had a very broad interdisciplinary education.
yes.
I mean, the professor of education was a man called Ben Morris, who had been at the Tavistock just after the war, and I remember him explaining to us as postgrads how the existence of the unconscious. We were all very skeptical about this, and he told a wonderful story about that he was a professor of education in Edinburgh, and he was called to some Royal Society to give a lecture or talk in the evening after a heavy day's work, and he came home and found himself putting on his pajamas. And then he realized that there was something at work in him that didn't really want to do it. I mean, I've experienced that sort of thing many times, I might tell you myself.
But actually this is sort of significant, because this awareness of the unconscious, of course, is very much has been part of my professional world, and will be relevant to thinking about family change and the forces that actually impact on people, of which they are not aware, as well as the things that they're consciously having to think about.
I want to just pick that up, because much later the judges are very jumpy, and put it that way, about anything that is mental health and the unconscious and psychoanalysis and all that. We've worked at that. Matthew Thorpe, Lord Justice Thorpe, who set up conferences which you know about, over the years. I mean, and he was very much aware of that. But and it's one of the reasons why I went to crisis intervention. I think you can get into the thinking about the unconscious and talking about the unconscious too soon.
Mervyn, your book places children very much front and centre of the concern about the process that families go through as a result of parental separation. And I was wondering, where that focus has come from, professionally, personally, how that has sort of come to be central to your thinking.
Well, I mean, there is a link, I know, personally, with a family that was going through lots of change and all that in my childhood. But professionally, it started with, I started thinking about children as a divorce court welfare officer in Devon. And up to until I did it, persuaded the chief probation officer that because I was lecturing on law, I needed to know something about divorce court welfare work. He rather reluctantly allowed me to do it, but in the early days of divorce court welfare work, they kept the interviewing of children very much, the chief probation officers in the Southwest, to themselves. There was also a man called Mr. Oak in the Royal Courts of Justice who was developing divorce court welfare work. But that's where I sort of began to think about the position of children and how do you represent the child's viewpoint in the court welfare reports for the court. Of course, the court seldom, if ever, saw the children directly themselves in those early days, and judges were very reluctant to interview children because they didn't think they had the skills to do it. So they left it to the court welfare officers to do it. And then as we moved on in the private law and public law field with care proceedings, there was the development of guardians ad litem and panels of guardians ad litem. So one began to see, and then when we developed mediation, there were some social workers who started off in the mental health, some were in mental health, but who were rust-proofers, and somebody called Joan Eastman, who was a tutor at Exeter, trained them for the early days of the Bristol Family Courts Conciliation Service. So there was experience there of social workers who were used to working with children, or some were, but the courts themselves tended to say it was very paternalistic, as I suspect it still is. So, and then it took some time to get money to do a research on children in divorce, which I did in Cardiff with a colleague called Ian Butler, who was a social work teacher, and two very able psychologists, Leslie Scanlon and Margaret Robinson, and Gillian Douglas, who was still is the dean now at King's College London, a law professor. And by that time the law was talking about putting not only the children first, but also assessing their voice and their views on decisions being made about them, and so on. So it was there, and so I thought, let's research children. Now, when we did it, in the early 2000s in Cardiff, and we got a proper sample, we had to go through a whole load of problems in relation to getting access through the parents and guarantee of confidentiality, all those sort of ethical considerations. But when we did it, we then found that there were a number of children who were really in dire straits in one way or another, and they were in crisis. It was a prolonged crisis, and it was really a crisis for a number of them of bereavement. I mean, they were feeling bereaved because their family had broken up or their parents had split up. Some children, of course, were delighted that, thank God, they were saying the tensions and the battles once the parents had separated, they weren't every day. But you could say, and then some were still in a sort of make-believe view that their parents would get back together and they would all live happily ever after again, all that kind of thing. I've written about all that not only in the Supporting Children book, but it's also in the Divorcing Children book, which we published in 2003.
And it's an important kind of link. I mean, using the word bereavement about an experience of family change,
Yes.
makes the connection with some of those early studies that were done about, how people respond to the death of
Yes.
a partner or
Yes.
of loved ones of one kind.
And I've forgotten who it was. Maybe Dora Black wrote an article saying that children being bereaved when their parents split up is a more complicated bereavement than just when a parent dies, bad though that is. But the challenges, of course, all the changes that they have to adjust to their lives, and the big concern was what was going to happen to their education. Because when they're in grief and they're distracted and there are lots of moves going on and they're uncertain about what's going to happen to them in the future, all these educational questions, I mean, the impact on the education is very serious. I don't think that's really been fully appreciated.
So many changes accompany parental separation, particularly if partners find another partner.
New partners.
The kids may find themselves moving around the country,
That's right. That's
being
right.
dislocated in all kinds of ways.
In all kinds of ways. School holidays, problems of who's going to have who and where they're going to be, all those sorts of kinds.
And all the research studies look at sort of academic attainment as well as health factors when they're trying to assess what the impact of parental separation might be.
And so there's a lot of quantifiable in the sort of work that the cognitive developmental psychologists have been doing, particularly with Gordon Harold and a few others, the Cowans in America, which show that these are very serious problems for children.
And you were saying you moved around a lot as a child. You had different schools, you had a lot of change.
We didn't go to school until we were 7. This was post-war, just after the war. And then my brother and I, my twin brother and I went to 9 different schools in between the ages of 7 and 12. And we were classified as educationally subnormal. And when we had 2 years or 18 months in Ireland, in Dunleary, just south of Dublin, at a Christian Brothers school, and having 3 hours of teaching a day, one of which was learning Irish, arithmetic, English and Irish. My father thought it was idiotic that we should be learning Irish, and we took that as a cue to play truant and go fishing with fishermen and all that kinds of things. We were really rather nature's children running wild, but so we failed exam after exam. So I do know really what disrupted education is like, personally. But,
what got you back on track then? How did that get recovered?
Well, you really want to hear the behind the story about, first of all, we failed the common entrance exam to a boarding school in Devon after we'd been to prep school. Mm-hmm. And then somebody suggested that we should go to King's School, Canterbury, and my father should write a pleading letter to the headmaster. And while headmaster was an entrepreneurial strange man, nicknamed Fred, there's a book about him upstairs, and we went off, and he said, while I'm talking business, my father was working for Lever Brothers, and he thought there was some money there that he could tap into, maybe get a boathouse or something like that. While we walked round the cathedral cloisters, we came across this very tall man with flowing hair and gaiters, who asked what we were doing and he turned out to be the dean, Hewlett Johnson, who was the Red Dean. Anyway, we said we were hoping to get to the King's School. Several years later, when I got admission to Oxford, the headmaster said to me, "You were very lucky, because when it came to taking your common entrance exam, you and your brother were hopeless and failed, but the dean was chairman of the governors, and he said, what about those 2 boys who thought I was the Archbishop of Canterbury?" Because that's what we had said. We met the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Archbishop was a man called Geoffrey Fisher. He was in Australia at the time. So the dean thought there was really something about us, that we must have something to think that he was the Archbishop. Turned out that the dean and the Archbishop were at daggers drawn, over all kinds of things. The dean was, of course, socialist, communist, and all that kind of thing. So, anyhow, he said, well, I think these two boys ought to be allowed in. So we were put in. He thought we would make a couple of good prop forwards for the first 15, and he was right about that. We were quite good prop forwards and so on. And I was placed in a boarding house full of scholarship boys who were being coached or fast-tracked to going to Oxford and Cambridge. And I learnt more from them than I did from the teachers. Because in the lower, poorer classes for the thickies, we had the less good teachers. They were mainly rugby coaches or cricket coaches doing a bit of teaching. But you know.
So peers actually very important. You can learn from your mates.
Exactly. And there was a lot in those days. It was in the 1950s, post-war. There was a lot of ferment of political ideas, and not as bad as Brexit, I should think, now. But you know, there was a lot of ideas about socialism or capitalism and all that kind of thing, and of course the services in the cathedral. We had quite a lot of Christian priests who were into social affairs of one sort or another. So there was a lot of discussion about all that sort of thing. But that stabilised us, and both of us. I mean, my brother went into the army, became an army officer, and then became a canon in the Church of England, and I went to Oxford and did law.
You mentioned you were a twin, and I was just thinking about the voice of the child, you know, something you've been quite passionate about in terms of trying to ensure that that's heard. And I just wondered about the experience of being a twin and whether that makes a difference.
Well, we were duozygotic, that's to say we were not identical twins, and I was born 12 hours after my brother in the Middlesex Hospital, London, in 1937, and I think it was a very difficult time for birth for my mother when I sort of appeared on the scene, so to speak, and we're quite different in character, and the family as a whole, largely extroverted. There was always arguments going on and sort of thing, and I always found myself being rather shy and being on the out. It doesn't sound it now, but on the outside, looking in at this strange place, really, which we ended up in, and all these moves as well, and so on. So I think that's part of the conditioning, if you like, of why. I just have, and I think I'm also intuitive. Get a nose for good ideas, as you do.
Well, I'm curious, you know, having grandchildren who are twins and thinking about the special kind of challenges relating to, you know, how they have their own voice, how they manage their differences.
Roman and I love each other very much. My twin brother, love each other very much. But we were always arguing and misunderstanding each other, you know, and people used to talk about us as if we were identical. So it was always the twins, and never. So you never got a separate identity recognised or supported.
So you differentiated yourselves. Really, you had the arguments.
Yes, exactly. But that set me up for being interested in law, I suppose. Yeah.
I mean, Gerald Kaplan, as a psychiatrist who was interested in community well-being, mental health, whatever term we want to use for it now, it had this sort of tripartite model, really, trying to prevent mental ill health in the community. And I was interested in how you've incorporated his thinking and applied that to directions which the family justice system might take.
Well, Kaplan was always concerned with all kinds of community services of one sort or another. I mean, nursing, community nurses of various kinds, school teachers, social workers, psychiatrists, and so on. So, but he was thinking of all in terms of first responder. I mean, I think one starts with first responders, and the first responders are usually to be found in the schools. And when I said, I'm not thinking just of state schools, I'm thinking of boarding schools as well, because it's quite clear to me, and was at the time actually when I was at boarding school myself, that a lot of children came from separated parents, or parents who were service personnel away and that sort of thing, so they were sort of intermittent parents, and they were being left with uncles and aunts in school holidays. And this whole idea of school, getting over homesickness, I think that must have been children in crisis, wondering what on earth's going on at home.
It's another form of separation anxiety, which of course is
Yes.
so prevalent when families are changing.
Exactly, and it is separation. I mean, and it's separation anxiety, which is at the centre of court welfare work.
How might we be thinking about the scope for education?
I think there's an enormous, and I've written about it in a chapter in the book, in fact several chapters in the book, it's primary prevention. And it's been a feature of the Green Paper on child mental health, which was published
2017, yeah.
And the idea being that there be a closer link between mental health services and schools, so that all schools would be able to provide what they term mental health first aid. There are models which have been used experimentally by a number of different schools. The Bridge Foundation here in Bristol is one, where there's social workers in close contact with schools and seeing children and families. There's also a Place to Be in London, and I wrote about that in a school in South London, which said the Place to Be organisation, which has got support from the Royal Foundation, I understand, provided money to engage a social worker or a caseworker in the school or a counsellor to see children in lunch hours if they've got particular problems. If the school teachers think suddenly a child's behaviour has changed, or they seem to be showing distress and there's difficulty about talking about it to them, they could be referred during the lunch hour or whatever to the counsellor, who will then pick them up as a crisis intervener and maybe work with the family as well when the parents come in to see. So that would be the first responder, and I would think that's much more important. When we're having to think about the scale, we have hardly mentioned the question of the scale of parental separation. We must be 200,000 children, so it's a huge amount, and we've been seeing all, as it were, the symptoms, not just because of reactions to parental separation, but all kinds of other problems which children have, bullying, the whole social media question about image and teasing and all that kind of stuff, which children apparently these days are experiencing. All these can cause emotional problems which are blockages to their educational performance. So alert-minded practitioners in the school or school teachers should be able to pick this up, and there should be a closer link with child and adolescent mental health. So not just to have treatment for seriously disturbed or children who are really in problems, but also to provide support for the school teachers in helping on this first level of intervention, which is sort of normal passage agent support while children are working through their particular crisis. The maturational crises of various kinds, the onset of puberty or things of that kind.
I can see two problems with this, one of which we can come on to a bit, which is how teachers regard their role and how they respond to the prospect of being given, as they might see it, an additional kind of responsibility. But also the question that children face in terms of how can they talk to somebody without feeling that they have a problem, or in some attract stigma of some description from the peers, because that process clearly is a very important one.
Well, I think there's a lot of education about behaviour which all children could have and benefit from. Well, these simple things like sudden changes and upsets as part of their sort of social education in the school. And you could do an awful lot there, and there are, I mean, James Wetz, who's been my consultant, if you like, on that side of things, would know a lot more about that than I do. But it's school being concerned with the whole well-being of the child and not just thinking of school as a place to tick up good ticks for academic performance.
Yeah.
They're interrelated, and so the whole dealing with the whole child and its child's well-being, and children themselves, helping children to understand that crises of various kinds is a normal part of growing up. I mean, so that they're not being seen as psychiatric cases in the making, but seen as, yes, you do get upset when your mum and dad separate, or when somebody in the family dies, or gets struck down by serious illness, or dad loses his job, or all those kinds of things.
Given that teachers are very important for children, particularly if they're going through flux themselves, and that emotional security is essential really for people's ability to learn, whether an adult or a child, it was making me wonder about the structuring of school systems as a whole. It's not just about how pupils might be encouraged to feel it's okay to talk to others about stresses in their lives, but what about the discontinuities that our education system brings into play for kids as they have to make moves from one school to another, change classes, teachers? All of these things affect their emotional equilibrium.
James Wetz, my consultant, who wrote this book, Urban Village Schools, is a local former school teacher here, did a study for the I think it was the Gulbenkian Foundation, or I think it was, where he looked at what kinds of education goes on in various kinds of parts of America and also in Denmark. And he was drawn to the idea of urban village schools, smaller scale schools, which take children from primary school right up to 16 in the same school, so that you don't get that discontinuity that you're talking about, the move from the primary school, where very often children have good relationships with their teachers, suddenly to find themselves in a much larger school, and sometimes not. Now, if you coincide that with other kinds of crises to the problem of adjustment going to school into the big school, with adolescence, onset of adolescence, puberty, all those sorts of things, and if separations at home, you get what's called a double whammy. Well, we've tended, or Gordon Howden people would refer to as double whammy. They're double crises, an extra level of adjustment that has to be made at a time when the child is particularly vulnerable. So continuity up to 16, he thinks, there's a lot to be said for that, and also to try and organise schools on a smaller basis. Going to boarding school is another major thing, and again, I've referred to that in the book, that so-called high net worth families who may have problems between mum and dad and separations, we'll shield the children from all the nastiness by pushing them off to boarding school. So they then feel they've lost their relationship with their parents, or either parent in a way, and they've got the problem of adjusting to a completely new context. So that's a crisis. I was thinking particularly of things like choir schools. I mean, younger children, and you get prep schools, children still going off to prep school at a very young age, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. So it's when they're very vulnerable. And so I actually wrote to my own old boarding school and told them about the book being published. They said, I'd like to see it. Whether it make any difference to them or not, I don't know.
No, they
but
should.
Things like matrons and school teachers in boarding schools should really be concerned with the mental health of their children.
And they're going to be, in the child's eyes, also acting as kind of substitute parents.
Yes,
they will, in our jargon, as it were, be picking up all the transferences from the kids in the absence of parents.
And they're putting on a brave face, be a young man, all that kind of stuff. I mean, and so you can see how people develop, or children can develop personas, which are defensive personas, which catches them out sometimes when they're in midlife, later when it's unsustainable.
If people are too far down the line in terms of where they've arrived at in parental separation, What scope is there for the family justice system to make a difference?
Well, the family justice system comes into it usually when there's a conflict about custody or contact, and obviously in relation to money. And that's where the argument is these days. When you went to interview the parents and they said how valuable and very often court welfare officers have been, that they'd opened up communications in the family, they'd talked with them about the children which nobody else had done, the solicitors hadn't really done, and that sort of thing. But they all said they'd come in too late, that they should have come in when we separated, not several years later, very often, when the divorce was going through.
If I can interject, what you've reminded me of was one of the sort of surprise findings we had when we did a study with family court welfare
Yes,
officers.
with Chris Vincent.
That's
yes,
right.
Yes, I remember.
And Barbara Dernier was the third
Yes.
member of the team there. And we followed them up about a year later, and we were really surprised to find how many of the families, the parents, had kept copies of the welfare inquiry.
Yes.
And one of the reasons they kept them was that this constituted a kind of representation of their experience. That in many respects, people are struggling with, how did I come to be here from where I used to be there? Trying to sort of re-establish a narrative,
Exactly, yeah.
a story that would make sense of your kind of current position. And the welfare inquiries, of course, provided a context in which people were talking about their experiences and being kind of encouraged, I suppose, to tell their stories in some respects.
There's a counterpart to that when you talk to children. Exactly the same, and you'll find it in Divorcing Children book with Ian Butler and others. I mean, how does this happen? Where all these kind of identity, they're really, what's happened to us? Where are we going? Are we going to be able to live in this house anymore? And all that sort of thing, yeah.
So when parents can't function, and often temporarily parents are disabled going through separation and divorce, because it's very,
well,
it can be very
grief very often too.
Yeah.
And one of the things, which again I don't think is always picked up, is that when they're angry with each other, in fact that's the anger response that goes with grief. I mean, people think, oh, grief is all tears and things, but it's also anger very often. Anger at what had gone, failed, and all that kind of thing, and this inability sometimes to look at themselves and to blame the other and all that.
Yes.
So,
And part of it's a protest, isn't it? This
yes,
is good Bulbian
that's right.
stuff.
And you've got children.
Yes.
We met children, particularly boys, and
Yes.
Gordon Harold has picked that up, the difference between boys and girls. That very often the girls think that they are to blame, and they will self-harm and slash their wrists and have eating disorders and things, whereas boys tend to be angry, more aggressive, getting into trouble with gangs, opting out of anything sort of sensible and all that kind of thing. So that again is what can be picked up by Kafkas, and in fact is very often. But I think that the clue is not just to do the report, but to see short-term crisis intervention to support children as they're making a more realistic adjustment, if it's possible, to a changed family circumstance.
And anger and protest is part of the territory.
Absolutely.
It's an unavoidable part of the emotional territory.
And it's something, of course, which social workers and lawyers find very difficult to deal with themselves.
Well, I was thinking one of the other important grief reactions is a denial that anything's happened at all.
Of course.
Not wanting to see, turning away from
that's
the realities. And people often will buy into that because it's much more comfortable, to pretend that things are going to be fine,
that's right.
rather than you might be sort of seething inside.
Douglas Hooper and I was involved in my early days as a social work teacher in helping a little voluntary social work agency find a new role for itself. It was on the whole giving boots to indigent people in the city and so on, and it's called a personal service department of Bristol Council of Voluntary Service. And so we thought, and Douglas put the suggestion, when you are doing research, what about these 10%, 11% of families where the father had been deserted by the mother. And these fathers were often completely knocked for six. And so we set up a little Motherless Families project, which I wrote up with Douglas, and I wrote up in the Bristol Journal of Social Work some years ago. But very often some of those men thought, oh, she's bound to come back. I mean, they were in a sense of total denial. And there are children, when again we've interviewed children, that they're often, oh, mum and dad will get together again, and they're in a sort of dream world about it all. Yeah. And feeling that this is unsure, has it really happened? So it was like some of the children said it was like living through a sort of dream. They couldn't believe it. All those sorts of things.
And one of the things that came from the study that we did was that, given that very few people now contest their divorce, yes, the unresolved feelings about a partnership coming to an yes end, then get channeled through contact, residence, conflicts, which yes sometimes, of course, reach the court. That's a way of having the fight. It's a
yes, I mean, this is what I thought, you see, again, the legal aid was such a crucial thing for the parents. And it was so, I mean, I wrote the book on supporting children because I was so angry about the sudden withdrawal of legal aid. And because dear old Kenneth Clark thought, oh, well, what are these people doing, arguing about knives and forks or things like that? He had no understanding at all about the emotional dimension that goes with parental breakup or domestic breakup and so on, and the importance of solicitors acting as partisan support. They see people through, or used to see people through the crisis of separation. And so they were what we've termed passage agents. And I see the court welfare officers, or CAFCAS officers, the role that I think they should be more willing to take on is being a passage agent for the children, to help the child through the proceedings, so that they can come to terms with what has actually happened and get back to living, or they want to normalize their life after this emotional upheaval when they can't cope.
The pressure on passage agents is connected, I think, with this sort of adversarial climate that can often exist between the parents. Yeah. And I was thinking about how important solicitors have been to individual parents, because they will represent one side of the story, and trying to take this to court and be proved, right in one way or another, has a sort of emotional kind of payoff to it. And I was thinking about we struggle not to have an adversarial system, but for parents who are in an adversarial state of mind, of course there is a match, that some of them really do want to go to war, to have a kind of Pyrrhic victory, as it were, in terms of
I think
the circumstances
there's a
they've been
continuum
through.
of families, a classification of families. I mean, there are those who can resolve this tension between being parents and separating out, and they can sort it out reasonably with themselves. I won't say they're amicable always, but they're clear of what their parental role is, and they're clear of and that sort of thing, and they can manage that. And then there are some which are still in the throes of hurt, but they're getting they were getting support from their solicitors. And we discovered, again with Justice and Welfare and Divorce, one of my early studies, that's where the idea of mediation came in. Because when the parents that we interviewed, and particularly the ones we'd interviewed who'd been through a court welfare system, said, why didn't they come in earlier? It was that idea which I took back to various people here in Bristol, and we had a conference up in the Senate House and set up the Bristol Family Courts Conciliation Service. But if their parents are fighting about contact or occasionally residence and so on, then that comes to court, and the court process itself can be experienced as a separate crisis. And that's when CAFCAS can pick the case up again. When we talk to the children whose parents have been, because we drew the sample from court records, it was clear that children hadn't spoken to anybody about it. And so some of them had unresolved contact, a crisis. And they were still in all kinds of problems relating to it. So and it was clear, but they loved to have it mostly. They were very responsive to the young psychologists who were interviewing them for research purpose. So it's from that point I felt we transposed to CAFCAS, and that is a job where CAFCAS officers who come in because the courts ask for a report, or sometimes to ask them to mediate at that point, or try to mediate. The need for the child to have passage agent support while the family is going through the court seems to me to be a very clear need, and it's not generally being recognised by CAFCAS or by government. So, you know, they're saying, oh, well, once the case is finished at the court, you should stop. You no longer have a role. Well, I'd be all inclined to say that there should be occasions where the CAFCAS officer can continue. There used to be what was called, maybe when you were a probation officer, I can remember it, called matrimonial supervision orders. And you could have a short term, and you can still have orders, family support orders, which could be used in those circumstances to continue to get, if a CAFCAS officer has got a good ongoing relationship with the child and it's being useful, then see them through it and help them. That seems to me, we old-fashioned ways, we used to call it casework or something like that. Short term, not forever, for long term or anything like that. Not therapy, but just guiding them and helping them through a major transition in the family's life.
So giving children a voice is one of the opportunities that the family justice system has.
Absolutely.
And because I was thinking about, you slightly changed the way you've been expressing the kind of area of work from using the term family justice system to participant family justice. And I have a feeling that's to do with children and their place here.
Not entirely. Nicholas Crichton, you may remember on committee, was a judge in London, died a few months ago, sadly. But he set up the Drug and Alcohol Court, special experiment funded by the Home Office, I believe, and the Nuffield Foundation, and bringing in social workers. The aim being to help people recover their children from care, and but with a court supervising this process of helping the parent who might have been a drug addict come off drugs, so that they could get their children back, and opening up all those kinds of things. It's all been written up. Now, that was a model of you might call it a therapeutic court if you like, but it was a participant where the court engages with the family, right, in this case a drug addiction, overcome a problem with the social workers helping, but reporting to the court, and where the judge, with his authority, was there in the background, as it were, supervising and providing a kind of stimulus and using it as a means of rewarding. So very often judges, I can see this years ago in certain cases where the special procedure was working, where that was a welfare check in divorce, where a judge would interview a parent and sometimes say to a parent, what a marvellous job you've been doing under such difficult circumstances. And you can talk to the parent afterwards. They were made to feel about 10 foot tall. So it's very reinforcing.
Very empowering, yes.
Very empowering. So that would be an illustration of a way a family court can engage with a family through a transition of one sort or another.
Wanting just to think about Douglas Hooper and how the two of you termed the sort of family justice system idea together.
Well, I had kept in touch with Douglas over the years, and as I developed research programs of various kinds in family justice, we worked together on a project on the family justice system. It was really called Support Services for the family courts, really. And So it was dealing with things like guardians ad litem and divorce court welfare work on probation and all those sorts of things.
And this idea of a system, people coming together.
Yes. So he just carried on his thinking from family systems thinking and family therapy. That's where he came from. And I came into it from thinking more from a sociology sort of idea of networks, Elizabeth Bott and all that kind of.
But the fundamental idea that the whole is
anthropology, yes.
The whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Yes.
That actually you need to think about the entity as well as individual components.
Yes, but also you have to. I mean, this is difficult to get the chronology of it all, but. I mean, when I was doing social work teaching, we got involved and we began to use the Grubb Institute and people like Ken Rice, who were linked with and Eric Trist. There were a number of them.
Yes, yeah.
Eric Miller was another, and they were working on the Beyond model of groups, small groups and intergroups and large groups. So all that thinking about group dynamics formed sort of background to my thinking, and was married up, I suppose, with Douglas and thinking about family systems thinking and so on. So eventually produce our book on, which became published by Family Law, called The Family Justice System. And we were linked. I've always had links with the judges through my research. So we introduced these ideas and this term, and to our surprise really, they took up the notion of the family justice system, because there was already a criminal justice thinking. You know, they were thinking about criminal justice in the crime field. And
well, the interesting thing about the systems idea and the thinking that came out of group relations, Tavistock Institute thoughts, is that of course some social systems are set up as kind of temporary institutions for a very specific task, and then they're sort of dismantled afterwards. And the family justice system, of course, seems to be a lovely example of one of those sort of temporary institutions.
Yes.
But the organising principle then for everybody involved, all the different kind of players, would be, so what are they working together on? What would be their primary task? This is a key question, isn't it?
It is a key question, but of course they don't think like that. The problem is they all tend to think, you know, court welfare officers or CAFCAS officers are doing reports for the court, the judge is deciding the case, or having to postpone it because it's not resolved, so it comes in the judge. All that, they're doing their judging stuff. And before we had the cuts to legal aid, we had the lawyers representing the parties. None of them saw themselves. If you said, I mean, there might be a few, but a lot of them didn't really see themselves as connected and interacting with families that were in conflict with one another, coming through the court, let alone dealing with the children, which, although they say they're dealing with the children, primary interest is always the child. In fact, I've often thought the children come last, largely because they don't have a voice.
Well, it's interesting because another aspect, of course, about the functioning of social systems is that they not only work to try to deliver on their sort of stated task, but the nature of the work can generate anxiety, which then makes people more kind of defensive about how they operate, and the groups then can organise themselves in ways which work against what they're ostensibly there to do.
Yes. Well, you have to ask yourself, what's the primary task? And they tend to think, right, well, we're making orders for, we're trying to sort out the contact arrangements or the money or something like that in a series of orders, or of course, domestic violence, protective orders for one thing, sort or another.
And what would you say is the primary task? What do you think?
Well, I see the primary task as helping a family resolve, first of all, dealing with a complicated relationship between the parents, which is how to disengage from an unsatisfactory, or one of them would think it's unsatisfactory relationship, while at the same time keeping the parental coalition together so that they can go on being fathers or mothers. And that's a conflict, and it's difficult to deal with. Now it gets dealt with by like a sort of, I was going to say a Japanese non-play or whatever, but I mean a whole series of actions that take place. And in the end, if they say, well, we've passed through the courts and, well, we've all settled down, and the children said mum and dad are talking to each other, or no, mum never speaks to dad and that's how it is, there's an outcome. Mm-hmm. There's always an outcome of some sort. And the question is how to get a satisfactory outcome so that the family can still, for all kinds of reasons, continue in existence, partly as a place where children and youngsters develop their identities. So that's the main thing. So
it's helping families manage that change, that transition from one state into another state.
Of course, law is important because it is a container. I mean, this is where my probation and your probation experience will realise. I mean, it goes back to, I mean, we're dealing with sometimes in probation very difficult, angry, dangerous people, but actually there's quite a lot of dangerous people when marriages go wrong or parental relations. I mean, I've said that sometimes in one of my books, I think it was Injustice and Welfare and Divorce, that I felt, based on stories that people told me, that if they hadn't been able to go to court, they would have been a punch-up and there might have been violence or there might have been murder. Yes. And we have to remember that quite a lot, I mean, it's a minority of cases, but it's still numerically quite a large number of cases which do end up with violence of one sort or another. And sometimes a few murders do take place in a domestic context. And the children often witness that. And that's very distressing.
I was just thinking about the systems notion, central to which is the idea of homeostasis, isn't it? And trying to get to a stable state and
the
balance.
Court is a mechanism with authority of the judge, which I think is important, of containing, one of the ideas that you've written about many times, of containing in a safe way some of these very angry feelings of one sort or another which get played out in the family's relationships, and the structuring of law and the structuring of orders, and well, we have to do this because the court judge said this and all that kind of thing. I mean, I'll just tell you a brief story where I was down in Plymouth, I think it was, when I was interviewing families there, and first of all I'd seen a mother and then I saw a father, and while I was with the mother, the telephone went and it was the father changing the arrangements over contact, and it developed into a row. And what I noticed was, she said, well, I shall go in the morning, I shall go and see my solicitor. And then there was a blank, 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 and you knew what. Well, in that case, I shall go to the court, and I'll get the judge, and so you got this, the angrier they got, the higher the authority they appealed to, they were appealing to contain it. And that was very vivid, and I think that is where courts come in. The problem is a lot of lawyers think, oh, that's all emotional stuff, best left to people, psychotherapists and people like that, but they're wrong. I mean, it's the powerful authority and symbolism of law which is deep in people's unconscious.
One of the points your book makes very clearly, and it's a message you've been transmitting, I think, for many years now, is that professionals don't collaborate very easily with one another. Now, when you're thinking of family justice, at the essence of this is a notion of people working together in the interests of effecting family change in a positive, constructive, creative way. But what is it that drives us all into our particular professional silos?
Well,
so that we find it hard.
You raise a lot of points there. First point I want to make is that at the local level now, because we've got local family courts, we can start thinking about judge-led teams, so that the listing officers and the courts administrators and the CAFCAS officers and the judges themselves the intake, people dealing with the intake into the court, all those sort of things can be seen as a team. When it comes to, so that's the first point. They're not yet tuned in to thinking of themselves in teams in the way that the medical profession has done in hospitals. So you get firms, you know, in the hospital context. So there's a lot of learning that has to be done there. There's also a feeling, I mean, not more than a feeling, I've observed with the biannual courts and conferences which the family division used to organise at Dartington, where it was thought, oh, well, we can rub shoulders with each other. So I know Mr. So-and-so, wonderful, we have a psychiatrist who comes once a year to talk to us about mental health, and one of the High Court judges, now very distinguished, I better not name her, but said, oh, we know all about mental health because we have it once a year from, and he tells us wonderful stories, all that kind of thing. Now that's not good enough. So I think that means they don't understand the frameworks which the behavioural psychologists and psychiatrists are using. And particularly when in the adversarial system you get a different type of expert on one side and then on another. So I think there is a case for saying, even if it's at a very ordinary level of understanding crisis theory, to think about the family as a system and to think about teams as a system. So you have your specialism as a judge or as a lawyer, and but you need to have a basic understanding of each other. Lord Mackay of Clashfern, at the time of the Children Act, gave a speech. I think it was called the Joseph Jackson Memorial Lecture. I'm not sure, I may be wrong on that. But he said, the black letters of the law, in family law, the black letters of the law don't take you very far. You do need to have a wider understanding of nature of family life, human growth and development and so on. Because they're making judgments about what is normal, what's abnormal, arguments about what's normal and what's not, all those sorts of things. And why do children, is another thing they're talking about. Seeing children as different individuals, even within their own family, is important. So when it's no good to say, oh, well, the children are settling down very well, that's not enough. It may be fine, it may not be fine, because one child may be reacting in one way and another in another way to the same set of circumstances. So there are lots of things about child development. I'd like to see family judges and family lawyers having a basic grounding in simple human growth and development, how families work in terms of systems, and generally family interaction. Don't need to go into deep unconscious motivations or any of like that. The problem is when you lot, I mean, problem that Tabby, you can slip into that because that's meat and bread for you, but for them you don't need to do that. You don't need to go to a deeper level. You may do, and they may be very curious to know about all those sorts of things if they want to study it. But are very simple things about how people act under stress, and why they might be in grief, and why they might be getting angry with each other because they've got an unresolved grief reaction. Those sorts of things, all family justice practitioners, I call them, collectively, should have a basic understanding. We need to train people for that.
Well, when I think, us lot, in a sense, are concerned with the kind of emotional experience, however that kind of manifests itself. And it seems to me that this is relevant to thinking about why it is that even though you've got some of these local court structures that can assemble teams together, still collaborating across professional disciplines can be really difficult. Yes. And you've written a lot about professional silos, how we all are tempted to retreat into our own professional identities, particularly in sort of situations where we feel kind of anxious. And of course, everybody's exposed to different degrees of anxiety by family change, family breakup, because none of us is immune from it. So it's close to home, this work. And the pressure to push that out in some way, not to get too close to it, is a pressure towards, if you like, getting things certain, getting your black letter law in place, not getting too close to the heart and to your own emotional experience. And that seems to me to be one of the sort of fundamental questions for us, how to engage with that reality which can divide practitioners, as even though their heads know that we really should be working together about this.
It's quite complicated.
It's complicated. It's a big question.
You're leading us into. It does raise questions about the way people think and where they've been trained to think, or whether it's by nature they like to think. I mean, lawyers, I think good lawyers are good at picking up points, arguing, being able to see the distinction between sometimes quite complicated things. And that's what legal training helps you do that. And sometimes because I work in a law school, I'm aware that lawyers are saying, oh, Mervyn, your sort of thing is all about emotions, isn't it? You're a social scientist. And sometimes the social work people say, oh, Mervyn, you're a lawyer. Well, I just happen to be a person who's crossed some of those boundaries. But there's something to be said about that. I do believe quite strongly that sound judgment in family affairs and wielding power over families and children and the future of children requires broad thinking as well as narrow legal understanding, legal points of argument. There was a quote, I think it was Lord Justice Ormerod, who said that years ago he was a doctor as well as a medical doctor, that is, rather than as well as a Lord Justice. That legal education leads to sharp minds, but the problem is it narrows while it sharpens. And so that's fine if you're dealing with contract law or torts or company law or international trading arrangements and all that kind of thing. But in relation to families, that's not good enough. You've got to have that, particularly if you go to the Court of Appeal, or even, as we've got a very brilliant family lawyer, now the President of the Supreme Court, Brenda Hale, but she's exceptional, but you do need people who have some understanding and feel for these broader social and psychological aspects, and what they sometimes call emotional aspects of family life.
It takes me back to your earlier point about what's the basic training that practitioners receive, because I was thinking professional identity is very much forged by the training you receive in your early days, and you have an allegiance to your own kind of training base. And so professional identities come up for review, I think, when we mix with each other. We're wanting to defend our own turf and sort of display our kind of credentials. And it seems to me that part of the professional problem mirrors the problem that family members have when they're going through change. Identities are being shaken in some ways. A lot of anxiety associated with that. So if you get fragmented families, you get fragmented systems, because they are picking up. It's infectious, isn't it? Sort of, the anxiety travels.
That's a totally good point.
Well, it's not my point. This is your mate, my mate, Douglas Woodhouse and Paul Pengelly, who wrote it.
So what's the answer to that, Chris?
Well, this is, well, actually, I think, again, your reference to Gerald Kaplan's work is really, really very important. You've written about mental health consultations and about the ongoing support that might be provided for lawyers from mental health practitioners, for mental health practitioners from lawyers, really, so that we understand each other and also can benefit from the knowledge and understanding and experience that have been accrued in our different professional silos. If that gets exchanged a bit more without it being threatening, you need to create a kind of safe environment where people feel that their identity isn't under threat.
Yes, one of the great things, people used to enjoy going for the 2 days Dartington conference.
I mean, what got family judges and psychoanalysts together?
That was an idea which Stephen Brown, President, or it might have been Elizabeth Butler Sloss.
Oh yes.
They agreed with, I think, with Matthew, that there ought to be I think it was Stephen Brown, a President's Interdisciplinary Conference or Committee I think I was one of the earlier people who sat on it. You might have sat on it
and
too.
joined later on, yes.
And then that was used as a vehicle. Matthew Thorpe used to chair it, and that was used as a vehicle to organise and arrange those biannual Dartington conferences, which people loved. But then austerity came and the money was cut off. But I only saw that as the first step. I mean, I thought that we could have gone on to having a summer school. And I think there may be something to be said, because people love status and numbers, names, letters after their name and all that sort of thing, that you might, if we were to project ourselves 10 or 20 years ahead, when Brexit's all been forgotten about, that one of the things that we should have is some courses, postgraduate or post-professional courses with master's degrees for judges or CAF officers in family justice studies. But you need somewhere, an institution to provide that. Could have been the Open University, or it could have been a university in the south of England or one in the north. I don't know, it doesn't matter. But it needs to be well resourced, with and lots of participant training organizations could feed into that. So you could get judges to do family justice studies and learn something about the different frameworks which in the psychological world which are being used, bring up to date on the latest researches on this and that, child abuse or whatever. We need to get that foundation of knowledge systematized. I mean, I've learned a lot of these things by chance and happenstance. I mean, really, just that the way my career has developed through research and been teaching and moving from social work, from law into social work, being trained as an army teacher, all those sorts of things, has given me a foundation. Some are up there in my head at the age of 80, plus my continuing reading and sort of thing, which alert-minded practitioners should be able to do. And you could do that on a weekend basis, or you could do all kinds of ways in which it could be done. But we need to, it's more than just this idea that if you rub shoulders with people at a conference and you get a judge from America or a judge from here and a psychologist from China, or that if they get together in a conference and like each other and share a drink, that somehow they'll know what they're on about, which is not necessarily the case.
It sounds like you need a centre, something that holds the project together.
I think it's going back to this idea of yours is fragmentation. One of the things why people go to court is that it does contain, you've made this point yourself in your writing, that it can contain conflict and prevent a degree of fragmentation when it comes to parental roles, at any rate. Many years ago, one of the spin-offs of my first piece of research was the setting up, as I've said, the Bristol Family Courts Conciliation Service. And I was invited by the then president of the Family Division, a man called Sir George Baker, to come up and address his annual training day conference in the Royal Courts of Justice. You want to hear it? Could I give 40 minutes talking about this new mediation service in Bristol? So off I trotted, very nervous. I went into the Royal Courts of Justice, went into what was then the President's Court, and be astonished what it was unlike any court that I'd ever seen, because instead of the Royal Coats of Arms was a huge stainless steel anchor on a blue velvet background, and on all the chairs, embossed on the back of the chairs in the court, were little anchors. Now, why was that? It was years ago, before we had a family division, we used to have a probate, divorce, and admiralty division of the High Court. And the admiralty used to deal with collisions and salvage claims and disputes and that stuff. And that was the symbol of justice. Now, if you thought about it, when I started doodling at the back of the court while I was waiting to be called, I started drawing this picture, and the scales of justice and a fisherman's anchor, I come from a naval background, are almost exactly the same. And what a fisherman's anchor does is it anchors you and it stabilizes you. And justice, when it's in balance, the front of my book cover, you'll see I've got the scales upset. But it's this getting back into balance symbolically is the important bit. That's what going to justice, I feel, if you like, unconsciously, this is why people go to court. Why the so-called intractable cases, they go back and back and back. They'll even ruin themselves paying for lawyers to go. But what they're doing, what drives them, is this notion that they want to get justice. And actually what they're doing is they're unbalanced. They know somewhere in their psyches, if you want to put it that way, that they're unbalanced. And they want to find a way of getting back into balance so they can go on and live their lives. And that's fundamental to the whole thing, really.
Your nautical image actually resonates so nicely with John Bowlby, you know, the psychiatrist, analyst's view about emotional security, and he talks about the distinction between safe havens, thinking about the nautical theme, and secure bases. And of course the safe haven is the place that you retreat to when the water's rough, you know, there are stormy seas, so you need an anchorage, so to speak. You need to retreat and get restabilized. And then when you're restabilized, you can, you've got a secure base, you can go out and explore, change things.
That's exactly right. And that is true, particularly for children.
Yes.
See, people, the problem is, in so much of this, it's all adult-centered still. The therapeutic organizations like yours all focus on the adults. It's fine, but it's actually the children have all these problems, even from very young children, and they're often needing. So that's where we need face-to-face, skillful, face-to-face work with children, sensitive, empathetic, giving children time, not rushing them to tick off some questions while you're doing your court report, but giving them enough time to work through these things and to help them see what they're going through is upsetting, yes, but they'll get through it. Yes. And nothing, one of Kaplan's things was nothing succeeds like success. If you get through a crisis, it increases your ego strength. Jared Diamond, in his book Upheaval, which is all about countries going through major upheavals, and we're all concerned about that at the moment. We're going into a crisis over Brexit. But I mean, he is saying that if we can come through it and succeed, then the country will get back into a stabilized state of mind, a collective state of mind, and then we won't have all these social divisions which we have currently at the moment.
And there's a sort of chicken and egg dimension to this, isn't there? Because one feels some of these social divisions, of course, create the crises. So,
and often in families, you'll notice actually that, I mean, if there are several children, you may, one or two children may be particularly upset, but others may be going quite strong. And a lot of children discover strength in themselves about how, that's another message that came out of the Divorcing Children book, and which I've referred to again in the Supporting Children book, the latest book. They can learn from that experience. Some of them have told us, we feel we've grown up a lot to our researchers. We no longer have illusions. We're not just happy families drifting along. You know, we know that life can be quite tough, and that you can have difficult moments in life, and you can come through it and survive, and help other children. I mean, one of the things that the children did, we found quite often were telling that they were wanting to talk to other children, their best mates, who had also been through a parental separation, so that they are supporting each other. Some schools try to capitalize on it and have what they call best buddy groups and things of that kind.
So the potential for, you know, young people to support each other through these kind of changes when they are so common is huge. And I suppose social media can both help and hinder in that process.
It does. I mean, and I don't know. I think Gordon, I think there are other people now looking at what is the role of the social media in all this, and I don't know. I don't do social media at all if I can avoid it.
Clearly the central message is that we're not paying enough attention to the child's voice. That yes, it's important to be attending to what's happening between parents, because if the fallout from that relationship hits the children, then they're carrying a double load, really, of distress, never mind all the sort of dilemmas about the potential of losing one parent. So giving them access to be able to talk about their experience, so that any sort of misperceived assumptions
in
they're
a safe
making,
context.
in a safe context,
and given time to do it.
Yes.
That's the important thing.
Yes.
And not just rushing them into it and saying, well, the school bell's going, we better stop. You know, you can't just do it, I imagine, like that.
So they can have their story as well
Yes,
as everybody else.
that's right, yes.
That's one thing. And in terms of this other main point that you've been making about professional collaboration, you've been saying a number of things, I think. One is, it would be very good to have some kind of institutional base, like an institute for family justice studies, something of that kind, that there's a scope for continuing professional development, perhaps with degrees, recognition of some kind or other that encourages people to embark on it, and that you know, case consultations of one kind or another by different members of the family justice system to each other could be a very important way of resourcing people both emotionally and cognitively in terms of the changes that are having to be made.
It's true. I mean, we've been talking about parental separation, but don't forget, I've also done with Nigel Lowe studies of adoption and adoption and fostering. And I'm well aware of the public law cases and all these child abuse inquiries which keep coming up from Jasmine Beckford. Every year there's a special case review. It points to the failures of communication between agencies and all that kind of thing. We've really got to tackle that at a fundamental level in training, training of social workers, health visitors, and so on. I mean, to overcome. And that's a complicated field which has been looked at in the health context, but we need to look at it in family justice.
Mervyn, thank you very much for your time talking about these really important questions affecting the future of our family justice work. You and I come from both same and similar kind of professional experiences, and there's such a lot of important overlap that that kind of experience should be shared with other people. So I hope that more collaboration across disciplines follows.
Well, it's very nice at my age, great age, in my 80s, to be able to offer something before I pass on.
You can't say that. You can't say that.
Well, you'll be able to cut that bit.
It's quite funny, yes. Well, you see, we didn't edit it out. Too many humorous moments ended up on the cutting room floor. And in any case, this film is not a conclusion. Mervyn continues to read, write and advocate for improvements in family justice.